So this is the fourth take on my time in the TRANG, South Vietnam in those days, as S2, head of intelligence for psychological warfare, with the 8th Psychological Operations Battalion. The TRANG, again, is about an hour north by air from Saigon, now Ho Chi Minh City. And is where I came to take over that newly formed intelligence section at 8th Battalion, which newly formed December 1st of 1967. Came in from the field. All right, well, let's talk a little about further about that. The briefings every morning were down at the Grand Hotel. Grand Hotel's still there down on the beach. And I would most mornings drive down, and I think we were in the second briefing, but the odd thing is the general was there, so it couldn't have been the second briefing, it had to be the first briefing. And, we'd hear what had gone on in Second Corps as best people knew and reported, and I'd sit there. I had an assigned seat back in about the third or fourth row. And these things lasted, I don't remember how long, couldn't have lasted too long. The 5th Special Forces group was also in the TRANG, and I would, I think only once went over and joined their briefings. They were very busy and very secretive and very deadly guys. They would perhaps tell that story, and perhaps tell the story of a similar operation that the Army was conducting beginning in December of 1967. We'll talk about Operation ISEX, which was also the told the broader version of that was told in the Pentagon Papers. If you ever heard of that, well, Google Pentagon Papers and you can find out what that was all about. Okay, so we'd sit in there, but one morning I was working on something. My team was something related to rice or commerce or something. We did a lot of different stuff at the unit, at our psychological operations unit. We looked at a lot of stuff, gathered a lot of information, and so forth. And the fellow who was the head of USAID or something or other, anyway, his responsibility was something to do with economic development and he sat right ahead of me and over one seat. And this guy always wore black. Came in there, and he always looked like he'd been sleeping in the back of his Jeep all night. And this guy would always look terrible. He was an older guy. He's older for me in those days, was, in his late 30s and early 40s. Everybody else was in there. We were all in the 20s at that time, and I was, 22, 23, maybe. So anyway, I'm tapping this guy's shoulder to ask him a question. And this guy looked at me like that. Anyway, never said a word. Well, this guy was one of the top guys running the counterinsurgency operations, and you can read all about him in the Pentagon Papers. And he was there a lot of the mornings, kind of sitting there in the third row, kind of like these guys. Oh, mercy sakes. All right. Well, as I've said, I lived in a villa in Nha Trang. I was off Phuket Circle, about a block or two on Mei Lin, MELINH, 8 Mei Lin. That is last time I was in Vietnam, which has been about a decade or so, more than a decade now. Mei Lin was there, beautiful little home. Not little, it was a big home. And we had six officers. In other words, I had five roommates there. And over time, one person or another would leave, and so eventually I was the senior officer at Mayland. Didn't count for much, except that there were certain duties and responsibilities that if things went sideways, I was responsible for. And things went sideways one day when one of our lieutenants moved his girlfriend. Their name in Vietnam, they're called COs. The women were called COs. And he moved his girlfriend into our villa. And there was plenty of reason to believe that she was Viet Cong attached. In other words, she was in our villa and she would be able to collect information. So I went to the guy and I said, look, you can't keep the woman here. You need to move her out. And he threatened to kill me. He said, you're not going to say anything. You're not going to do anything. And if you do, I'll kill you. Well, my life got threatened in the newspaper business. My life got threatened other times in Vietnam. And it's always upsetting. So I went on back down to our unit, and I went into my commanding officer. He's a major, good guy. I remember his name was Mercier. And pull up a chair, and I said, look, I got a problem here, and this guy is blah, 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 blah. And he just nodded. And he said, okay, it's taken care of. And it was. And I went back to the villa that evening. This lieutenant was gone. All of his stuff was gone. He was gone from the TRANG. I don't know where they sent him, but he was gone. And so I didn't take that stuff lightly by any means. And in a few days, somebody else moved in, and they did not bring their girlfriend along. They just didn't do that. Now, we flew in and out of Nha Trang next door at the Air Force base, right next to Camp McDermott, and the runway was not that long of a runway. It had been built by the French, probably somewhere in the 1940s, 1950s. French built a lot of stuff, and we just moved in 1954 after the Paris Accords, which ended the French involvement in Vietnam. They'd been there since the 1860s. And they went away after Dien Bien Phu, big battle up in what is now northwest. It had been in North Vietnam. And anyway, this airstrip, which we flew in and out of, always, lots and lots of times. That's probably, that was my home Air Force base, home. And we didn't ride around much. I'll tell you about the story about when I drove down 30 or some odd miles with with someone else down to Cam Ranh Bay, which was down there. But anyway, about the airstrip. Airstrip's closed today, probably been, if not redeveloped, probably will be redeveloped, a pretty good hunk of land. And the current Vietnamese government, who took over, really had a great airport handed to them at Cam Ranh Bay. And so when you fly into Nha Trang today, I think you fly into Cam Ranh Bay. You do not fly into Nha Trang because, unless they built another airport there, because the airport at Nha Trang is closed. Now, this is the story of the desire of the Vietnamese government and the president of Vietnam, since he was, they had their own commercial airline beyond their military stuff, and it was known as Air Vietnam. And Air Vietnam decided they wanted a 707. They wanted a jet. They wanted a modern jet. And so they quacked around about that for a while. And so finally, I think Pan Am gave it to them. And probably the federal government, U.S. government probably paid for it. And lo and behold, now Air Vietnam has a 707. And there's a presidential retreat, a beautiful, beautiful home on the hill that sits astride the Navy base, which if you go into Vietnam by cruise ship today, you will go into the old Navy base. And then over the hill, not very far, was Nha Trang itself, Camp McDermott and so on. But you had to go over this hill. And on the very top of this hill was this beautiful home. Never got in it, but that was the presidential summer home, vacation home, whatever. So now the president of Vietnam has his own 707, and he says, I want to go to Nha Trang. Well, you can just barely land a 707 on that airstrip in Nha Trang. Okay, now, by the way, that airstrip ended at Beach Road, and Beach Road was a very short, it was on the beach. That's why I call it a beach road. And then way out there was an island. I'll get the name of it. But anyway, the Special Forces and Mischief guys were out there in those days. And today, you can take a gondola aerial that goes out there. But in the day, it was in the hands of military, but it was tall. So you take off, and you either got to bank out, which kind of planes were flying out of the, which were the 123s, and the O-2Bs, which were the Cessna Super Skymaster, which I flew mostly. Unless I was going up country, in which I'd fly in maybe a 130, 123. Anyway, these planes could get up and then lumber up, and they're well off, over the beach road and bank out and go where they're going. And particularly the O2, which was a Cessna Super Skymaster. Love that plane. It was just a sports car. Anyway, a 707 could get in to Nha Trang, and did. Came in, ran into something or ran off into the South China Sea. So anyway, the president flies up there grandly, and he lands in his 707, and he goes off to Zing, and then after a few days or whatever, he comes back and says, I'm ready to go home. And they said, we cannot get this plane off the ground in the current weather and humidity and so forth. We can't do it. We're going to crash. You will die if you try this. So he goes away, and the plane sits here and sits here and sits here. And it's waiting for the absolute perfect weather, humidity, conditions. Because if they are, you can get it off. Now you have to take at the end of the runway, there's a little fence, not very tall, which is where Beach Road is, and then you go Beach Road, and then you go to a little bit of sand, and then you're into the South China Sea. Okay? And so one day, somebody, probably, unless the guy comes running into my SQ office and says, they're going. And I knew what that meant. Everybody knew what that meant. That meant they're going to try and take off that 707. They're going to try and get it out in that Trang because the conditions are perfect. Okay? So everybody goes over there. And here it comes. That is great. That plane, they got that plane up maybe 8 or 10 feet off by the end of the runway. Okay. and off it go, off it goes. Didn't hit the fence because they'd taken the fence down. They back in there, put the fence back up under each road, and then off it goes. Now it's heading towards. It's heading towards the island. Okay, so they're gonna have to bank, but they don't have a lot of, now they're what, 10, 15, 20 feet off the off the ocean, and eventually it's gone. And so they got it off. Now, that's not the last time I saw that plane, because much later, when I was down in Saigon for a better part of the year running Tong Cam magazine, getting that, I went up to Dalat, which is like Geneva. It's Lake Lucerne. I mean, it's just and Dalat was a vacation spot up in the mountains that the French again built, and they built a runway up there in between Dalat and in Saigon, or the rubber plantation. They were living a pretty good life until World War II came along and kind of upset everything. Got the communists going and put the French in pretty much an untenable position in Vietnam. Well, anyway, so I go up to the lot, and I'm looking at a pumpback station, which is a hydro plant, which had been built in the mountains up there with, and I'll tell this story later on, with French reparations. And as we're landing in the lot, I don't remember when I flew up there, maybe Air America or somebody, and I'm landing, I kind of look out, there's something been dumped off the runway here. What is that? They said, oh, that's a 707. The president came up here, and he wanted to, he's vacationing up here in Dalat, and came in on his Air America 707, and they told him he couldn't get it off. They told him, you can't do this. And I guess the president said, well, I got the plane off in the TRANG. I'm sure we can get it off here. Well, the reason you can't is because if you leave the 707 in the lot, the only place for the 707 to be is on the runway or runway adjacent, which means you can't use the Dalat airstrip anymore if the 707 is sitting there. And if you can't fly the 707 off of there, then you have blocked the lot, which is up in the mountains, and you ain't going to drive there. And the train doesn't run here anymore. The tracks are there, but the train doesn't run here anymore. The only way to get in and out of Dalat in 1967 and 68 is by air. And so the 707 has to go. They pushed it off. And as I recall, the airstrip at Dalat was built kind of with, kind of on the top, kind of flat, but it had deep, kind of deep cliffs that went off, maybe not that much, maybe 20 or 50 feet. Okay, but and that was the end of the 707 and Air Vietnam's venture into the jet age. All right, we have we're working our way towards Tet, which was at the end of January 1968, and we will be telling that story, but we've got a number of other stories to tell before we get there. So there will be more on Nha Trang, at least one or two more before we get to Tet, and but we're going there as best I remember Tet. Okay.